Hi, it's Mark Callahan. Let me go give you a tour of my exhibit here at the Durham, the Lunchbox packed with pop culture. Let's go ahead and head in. This journey, took a lot of effort, but I'm going to walk you through it from soup to nuts, okay? All right. Let's. This is just like an intro panel, if you will. These were old advertisements that were used to market the lunchboxes back in the 60s and 70s. On the right-hand side, you have one from Aladdin, which was one of the main producers of lunchboxes during the 35 years when lunchboxes were popular. On the other side of the display, we have a thermos advertisement, which was the other competitor. So these two had about 50-50 market share during the 35-year period when lunchboxes were very popular. And then in the middle here, kind of unique, is a display case or the display header that you would have seen in like a Walgreens or a department store where they would house the lunchboxes that would be for sale. And this one is by Aladdin, and it's probably in the mid-70s is when this was made. The cardboard structure. Or inside here are 6 lunchboxes, and they're not all would have been in the same case. Some of these are different time periods, like Annie and the Beverly Hillbillies were not really popular at about the same time, nor was Secret of NIMH. But so this is a very cool display. And then let's go over to here. This is kind of this Pac-Man lunchbox is really the starting of my collection. So I bought this at a flea market in 94-ish when I was attending Creighton University. And back then, that's how you used to buy and sell lunchboxes, was you'd go to antique stores, flea markets, garage sales, and you'd negotiate face-to-face. And that's what I did here with this one out of it was at a flea market on Saddle Creek Road in Omaha, and I probably paid $15 to $20 for it. But what happened is, since I grew up in Germany, we really didn't have these vintage lunchboxes for sale. It was much more of an American thing. And so when I came and bought this first one, it got me on this journey to find a bunch more, and I saw price guides, and that got me more into flea markets, antique stores, and then eBay came around, and that's how I bought most of these lunch boxes over the last 30 years. This one here is really what I carried, the old textbook brown, the sack lunch, and that's why I have that in there. So you can read the story there, but the bag is really from my mom, who helped me collect, and those are her initials. When she passed away on August 17th. So this is kind of like a dedication to her. The exhibit is organized kind of in chronological order here with the timeline of the history of lunchboxes. And so we start here with John Montague, who is a Earl of Montague, or he's called the Earl of Sandwich, 1762. He is largely attributed with having quote-unquote invented the sandwich. And he was an avid gambler, and he didn't want to leave the gambling table. And so in order to not leave the gambling table, he asked the person to go make him a sandwich or make him something he could eat at the table, and they brought back a piece of meat between 2 breads. And then they wrote about it in high society newspapers and called it the sandwich after the Earl of Sandwich. And that kind of started this whole concept of mobile food and so forth. But in the 1800s up to the early 1900s, most people used old tobacco tins and biscuits to carry their lunch as they started to go to work more, and they didn't, this was a time we didn't have microwaves and fast food and all of those things. And so these are some old tobacco tins. And then in 1914, the Thermos Company, which had been making bottles for keeping liquids hot and cold, they created this lunchbox specifically marketed towards school children, which was the first time that ever had happened. If you can look at it, it's a very posh type lunchbox. It's leather strap, embossed and a nice metal containers. This cost $3.50 in 1914. So that sounds like not a lot today, but when you go back, if you adjust that for inflation, at that time that was the equivalent of over $100 for people to buy a lunch kit for school. And one of the things I did is I said, well, what was the lunchbox at the end of the era of lunchboxes, 1985? What was the cost there? The nominal cost was only $5. Yeah. So you can see kind of the economic benefit of mass production, adoption, economies of scale. So there's an economics lesson there. So they really kind of came down in price in real dollars over the next 60, 70 years, which is an interesting fact I thought that I'd kind of uncovered during this exhibit. Well, thank you. Yeah, and then in the 20s and 30s, companies started to put images on tins. Nothing licensed, so these are by companies like Ohio Art, and they would put school children at a picnic. That's widely considered one of the first times that a lithographed image was on a lunch kit. And then there's some other ones that followed suit. There's a whole bunch of different types. This one is also very interesting. It's a circus tin, which I find it interesting because my parents had it growing up, and I was able to buy a new one. I have the original one at home, but it has a dent in it. Now, if you fast forward, I know we're skipping, not skipping, but we're going through the decades pretty quick. This is 1935. This is the first time that a licensed character was put on a lunch tin. That licensed character was Mickey Mouse. It still wasn't the lunchbox that we know today. It was more of a tin, an oval, as you can see. And the one on the pedestal is from the United States. And then the one down here I was able to acquire from the same era. It's from Japan. And up here, which is very cool, is the original advertisement and marketing for this lunchbox back in 1935 from the company Gruder, Peschke, and Fry. And it talks about the lunchbox itself and how much it was play. But this is truly the first licensed character on a lunchbox, but it never really took off after that. It took about another 15 years before these lunchboxes became mass-produced with licensed characters. Here was one of the catalysts, was Hopalong Cassidy. If you think about Hopalong Cassidy in the late 40s or early 50s, probably one of the most known TV characters for the children at the time. And Hopalong Cassidy was a marketing genius. He marketed everything. He was in movies, you can see his images on bread, you can see it on milk cartons, silverware, plates, I mean everything. There was even a Hopalong Cassidy kind of amusement park back in the day. And so seeing the popularity of Hopalong Cassidy, a company called Aladdin, who had been making lunchboxes without imagery on it, decided in 1950 that they were going to put Hopalong Cassidy on a lunchbox. And there you can see it here. It's kind of a beveled decal that they affixed to a plain red lunchbox. You can kind of see the plain red lunchbox that they did basically the same year, and then the Hopalong Cassidy. And so here are some notable firsts. I mean, these are some of the first dome lunchboxes. Hopalong Cassidy was one of the first lithographed lunchboxes, fully lithographed, so no decal, as was this Roy Rogers, which was by Thermos Company. These came out in the early 50s, 53 and 54. And when they got away from the decal, and they went now to printing it directly on the metal. And so this was the first fully lithographed print on tin. And then these lunchboxes followed suit. This one I put up high. It's probably one of the most collectible lunchboxes. It's the very first Superman, 1954. It was made by a company, Universal. And this one, honestly, is probably the most valuable in the collection. And it's very, especially given its condition. I bought it from a guy in New Jersey. And so it's very cool. This one, don't tell anybody, but this one I snuck in here just to see if anybody could figure it out. This is truly the right lunchbox in terms of topic, but actually I'm sneaking it in because that's part of the story is they used to make reproduction lunchboxes, or they make reproduction lunchboxes today. This is actually a reproduction. Don't tell anybody. All the rest are authentic. I have the authentic, but I thought it'd be kind of fun to sneak in one that, like an Easter egg, if you will, as they call it. This one is interesting. It's on Kit Carson. On the other side is Davy Crockett. It's by a company called Adco. Adco used to make lunchboxes in the 50s. They had the license to make Disney lunchboxes, which we can all imagine the lucrative nature of a Disney contract. All the characters are timeless and kids love it. What happened is Adco, the person who made this lunchbox, mistakenly or inadvertently put Kit Carson on one side, who is not a Disney character. As a result, Disney canceled the contract with Adco, and that contract then got picked up by Aladdin Industries, who was one of the major manufacturers of lunchboxes. So that's why this one is called out specifically. It has a very interesting story to it. This one has a very interesting story too. They're the first vinyl lunchboxes. Vinyl lunchboxes were pretty short-lived because they weren't quite as durable as the metal and even the plastic. It's basically like cardboard that's in between these vinyl, and so with any sort of elements or weather, they tended to mold, or they would buckle, or they just wouldn't be very safe, or not safe, they wouldn't really hold the food very secure. Yeah, so to get them in decent shape is a little bit more of a rarity. To me, I think they're some of the most beautiful lunchboxes because they're a little bit rarer. They started really in the late 50s through early 60s, and so we'll have some of those on display. Over here, this is interesting. Disney School Lunchbox was produced many years, since I think about a decade, and it ended up being the biggest selling lunchbox for Aladdin, and they've sold over 9 million units of this over the 10-year period. Very popular. This is the US version down below, and then up top is the version that was made in Spain. There's a few slight differences in terms of the characters, as you can see, just the colors of them and so forth. Huckleberry Hound, when this lunchbox was produced, it's hard to see, but on one side they used to make them all flat, so nothing on them. But this one is embossed to give it a 3D kind of effect. And you can kind of see it's the first lunchbox that was ever embossed, and it's very slight embossment you can see. On the other side it's still completely flat, which is unique because lunchboxes were either embossed or flat, and this one, as it was the first one, has some embossment on the front, which I think is kind of cool. And that became a signature of Aladdin Industries. As they made their lunchboxes, they were the only ones that made embossed lunchboxes. And as you keep going into the mid 80s, late 70s, people started to make plastic lunchboxes. They started moving more to plastics. Some say that the folklore is that a group of Florida moms were so agitated with the fact that kids were hitting themselves with the metal that they deemed them as weapons. And as a result, legislation, they petitioned for legislation to have them banned. That's the folklore. I've never been able to independently verify it. But in my talking with the artists that made some of these lunchboxes who were in the meetings in the 80s and 70s, it really was more economics. Plastic's cheaper, more durable, easier to produce. And so these are the first kind of plastic lunchboxes, Snoopy being one of the first ones. And then these plastic domes, which were Popeye and Flash Gordon, which are very cool. They're more durable than the vinyl, but the reason why they became more popular is really cost. I mean, the cost of metal versus the cost of plastic is night and day, really. We've got about 500 lunchboxes over here on display. And we organized them by categories. So you have international lunchboxes on the far left side, and those are anything that's made outside the United States. And there's not really many. Most of that dynamic of the growth in lunchboxes was in the United States. However, sometimes they made quite a few in Canada. I've got a few from Brazil, England, Spain, and Japan as well. And then as you go through, there's the vinyls. These are a subset of vinyl lunchboxes that were made. I think, to me, those are some of the most cool, beautiful, and especially to have them in that sort of condition. Let me see what would be notable. I mean, the Dudley Do-Right of all of those is probably the most unique and cool. It's the blue-rimmed one by a company called Ardee, A-R-D-E-E. There's just very few of those in existence, hard to hunt down. Then we get into plastics. I went back and forth. Most people don't like the plastic lunchboxes, but in reality, in the late 70s to early 80s, they did make some very cool pop culture icons on plastic lunchboxes. And so I did a good selection here of whether it's advertising, Disney, television shows. You can see a lot of advertising, like SpaghettiOs or whatever those are, Alpha, Iolos, I don't know what that is, He-Man, Thundar, Scooby-Doo, Chuck E. Cheese, some of the things that I think people would find interesting. Also, kind of similar to the vinyls, there's a smaller production of this section here called, it's metal dome lunchboxes. There probably were only about 40 or 50 different metal dome lunchboxes made, but I think they're super cool. These are some of the more collectible ones for people. Specifically, here you can see the Jetsons is a very popular one, and the Star Trek, as well as the Lost in Space. Those are probably the top 3 US-made dome lunchboxes that were popular. But if you go over here, we've kind of mixed a couple in, but you see the big Tom and Jerry and the Woody Woodpecker, those were actually made in Japan. And those are 2 of my favorites. I just think the colors are awesome. And I actually have, and they're not on display, but there's also a yellow Tom and Jerry, same image, but yellow, and then a red Woody Woodpecker. It's kind of cool. This section, unique designs, I had a lot of fun with this because as you think about it, you know, the standard rectangle lunchbox or standard dome lunchbox, those are pretty well mass produced, but you know, in a spirit of innovation, the firms tried to do stuff different to capture kids' eyes. And if you go down here, you've got like I still don't know if that's a pickle or a peanut way up top. It's a peanut. And that was kind of a way, just kind of different shape. Then you get down to interactive type lunchboxes where they would leave spaces for kids to write on them. So here's the, what's my favorites? My favorite pop group, my favorite color, which kids like to do anyways today. They do it all the time. And then you've got a couple vinyl brunch bags in here, which were unique designs. Embossed plastic lunchboxes. You can kind of see how much they pop out. Those were very cool and very unique for the time. Those are late 70s, early 80s. And then a sandwich by Peter Pan, the peanut butter manufacturer. So these are just really kind of like what were the unique designs. And these were also very unique designs, kind of the heads of Disney characters. They made a Mickey and a Minnie. Again, kind of short-lived. None of these really caught on in a major way with kind of but they were an attempt of doing something a little bit different than the traditional rectangle. I actually have the artwork for some of these, but they were on display. Now the rest of this is all the traditional rectangle lunchboxes that we're familiar with. And the way we group those is by their topic or category. So patterns, westerns, comedy, action and adventure, exploration. But yeah, you can start to see I like the music section. You've got Kiss, you've got Hee Haw, you have all three of the Bee Gees down there. So yeah, this is the wall. We've got action and adventure, which is kind of fun. There's Rambo. That was the last lunchbox made by Thermos. So this goes back to that concept of the Disney contract that I was talking about, that ADCO lost the Disney contract. I mean, you can see how many different Disney lunchboxes, and this is probably a fraction of what actually was made. But all of these up to, from, where's Disney? All of those in the blue are Disney branded lunchboxes, which were all made by, majority of those are made by Aladdin. There's a few that were from that company, ADCO, before they lost the contract. Let's see what else we have here. Muppets and Puppets. Well, actually, Dr. Seuss is a nice one. That's kind of a nice one-off lunchbox. The art for that lunchbox, I have one piece of it, but at auction, front side of it sold for over $30,000. Because the art was done by Dr. Seuss himself, Theodore Geisel, I believe his name is, and he actually did the original art, and that's why I think it went up more than traditional. But the original artwork for these things can be hard to find. Another brand that I didn't quite appreciate had so many lunchboxes was Hanna-Barbera, which was really popular in the 70s. And obviously I equate them a lot with the Flintstones, but you go through this list and it's a lot of classic cartoons that I watched growing up that I really wasn't sure they're Hanna-Barbera or not, but like Adam Ant, Secret Squirrel, you've got Hong Kong Phooey, kind of those little off, not quite as main brand cartoons, but I remember them, a lot of people remember them, Huckleberry Hound, Speed Buggy, and the Flintstones. They made I think they made 3 or 4 Flintstone lunchboxes, I'd say at least 3. And this is the first one they made from the late 60s. We can close up with kind of the comedy and the action heroes. I mean, these are it's a wide range, from G.I. Joe to something called Double Deckers, which I'm not familiar with that show. I don't know if anybody is familiar with Double Deckers right here in this blue lunchbox. Mork and Mindy, Welcome Back Kotter, Happy Days. They also made a Fonz lunchbox, which isn't on display here. But the Fonz lunchbox is it's basically they photoshopped out the other characters and it's just the Fonz on there, kind of like that, okay. Yeah. But he's a very popular character. And what makes this one cool to be paired with Hall of Heroes is we've got the superhero lunchboxes. So all these folks, the Spider-Man, Superman, Hulk, I mean, a lot of those are featured in this adjacent exhibit. And those are some of the more popular lunchboxes. Those characters, like a lot of the Disney and some of the other action, these are timeless characters. I mean, these are items that kids still relate to today. So this section here, the 2 main manufacturers of lunchboxes during this time were Aladdin and Thermos. Aladdin was based in Nashville, Tennessee. Thermos was up in Connecticut. And they were neck and neck through the entire lunchbox golden age. I went through and said, of all many different lunchboxes were made, by whom? And by whom? By what manufacturer? And you can see, and the period was 1950 to 86. Aladdin, just slightly more than Thermos, but essentially a kind of a 50-50 market share as it would go. And then when you look at it, you have Ohio Art was number 3, and they stopped making lunchboxes in the late 70s. but they had 54 different lunchboxes they made. And then there were 21 other producers, smaller ones, Adco, RD, Universal, and so forth. 21, and they made 5 each. 5 different ones each. So they were like the small potatoes, and a lot of them exited the market when Aladdin and Thermos became so prominent. And so the reason why you see a lot of Star Wars stuff here and then Disney here, those were the 2 main contracts. So, you know, you think about franchises, Thermos had Star Wars, which was the hottest movie of all time in the 70s, and then Disney, by way of that, that company losing its contract, they had Disney, which was a big contract. And you can see this is the original artwork. It's one-of-a-kind painting that was done before they made the lunchbox. It's all framed, but if you took it off, you'd see the production markings around there, the colors, like stuff that was internal to the company, never released, and it's really never been on display. The lunchboxes people have seen, and but the artwork has never been on display. That's what I really like, and I think that's what's very cool about this exhibit. And what they would do, you know, this picture here, every year when they would decide on what their new line of products was going to be, the companies would go to big trade shows in LA, in Chicago and New York, and they'd set up their booths and market their wares to wholesalers, you know, big buyers and things like that, and they'd pre-sell orders on things like, you know, their new lunchbox. They'd pre-sell what they would have, and they'd take orders, and they'd market it pretty well right next to Thermos and so forth. They'd get books that basically said, here's our lineup, here's what's interesting about them, here's some facts to help you sell these items to the retailers. And this is an original book. It's from the early 80s, but each one, it kind of goes through boys kits, girls kits. It's a salesman brochure. It's a salesperson brochure. They'd also put these things out for the salespeople, which every year, here's kind of our new lineup. You open it up, it tells you, you know, how you can buy them, the different sizes of the lots you can get, the costs, the displays that you can buy. This was probably one of my coolest individual displays. It's not so much that the topic Street Hawk was a popular show, but what this element is geared towards educating folks on is how was the lunchbox made, what was the process. And so it's called The Birth of a Lunchbox. And the way it would start, every year they would do this. You'd kind of look at the popular shows, and the execs would get in a room with the artists and say, you know, here's what are kind of the top shows, here's what we think we should produce. And then they would go, and if they had the licensing agreement, like a Disney or some other firm, then they would go, and the firms would send them pictures from the show. These are actually from the studio. They would send them to Aladdin, and then the artist and Aladdin would say, okay, let me mock it up. Let me make a prototype of what a lunchbox could look like with this show, Street Hawk. So those are the original photos, and you can see this top and bottom are what's called concept art. The concept art is before they even got approval. This is what they would show the executives who own the show, as well as internal executives to Aladdin, to say, here's what it might look like, the front and the back. And you can see what I think is really cool. And this was, until I was laying all this out, I didn't really know this. I mean, I knew it when I bought it, I kind of lay them out. Look at the pictures and how they use them, right? You can see them transcend or transfer into the artist's work, right? And the little motorcycle jumping, And then this was a smaller painting, and you can tell, I mean, if you get up close, you can see the brush strokes. Once this got approved, then it went into this type of a stage. This is also a painting and artwork. It's much more in line. Once it's been approved, this is now what the final lunchbox would look like. It's 1.5 times the size of the lunchbox. That was kind of the standard for Aladdin at the time. That's how they did it. So there's a lot of these pieces that were made. Not all of them were maintained. A lot of them got destroyed. But this one most closely aligns with what the lunchbox has. This was like the final painting before they went to production. And this is the final painting for the side of it. These are even more rare than the front pieces because they're so much more fragile. They're actually, all of them are in 2 pieces. Not many of these are in existence just because they're so fragile and they're so unique. And then when they got through this stage, then they would do proofs and test runs to test the color. So this is kind of a color separation sheet of all the lunchbox, and you could lift that up. There's 3 or 4 sheets, you know, red, yellow, black, and different gradations to show the overlay of the colors on the final lunchbox. And I don't know, this might be a good way to show, we pivot over here because this would really be the next step. They would then print those on metal. So these are like the metal production sheets that they use to kind of do the final test runs for the artists in Aladdin to say all the colors are right, the context is right, okay, let's print. So these are solid metal. They'd also do these on glossy paper. So I have both the posters and then the final metal sheets. And so these are from Aladdin. This is a cool one, Dick Tracy. I have some, you can see, I mean, they write on them, right? So I have probably about 20 of these different things, not different content too. And you'll see where artists have marked them up and said, this isn't right, this is wrong. Then they go back and adjust it and do them again. And the reason why we have this stand here is you can imagine with like a licensed character, you have contracts with Disney and all the folks that own the characters. Sometimes they'd produce generic lunchboxes, non-licensed characters, and that's what these are. So generic scenes, Rough Rider, skateboarder, cyclist, and for these, the manufacturers did not need to pay royalties, so they could keep all the profits. But as you might imagine, the generic ones probably weren't as popular with the kids, so they weren't quite as big of sellers. So you're kind of trading off volume for profit margin, and if you're an executive at Aladdin and Thermos. This whole section over here, which I think is interesting, you can imagine that not every lunchbox that got pitched actually made it to production. And so what I captured here are what are called concept arts and ideas. And so these are just sketches and drawings of potential lunchboxes for that time, and they were never made. So MASH never had a lunchbox. Some of these, they had a desire to make like a series of race cars of different things for probably young boys, but they never got produced. So that's one kind of element of what I'd call prototype type lunchboxes or concepts. In some cases, this is a show called 240 Robert, which was short-lived. I think one of these guys is Mark Harmon. I don't know, he's been in, 80s sitcom guy or 80s actor. But 240 Robert, they actually did make a few lunchboxes of, but it never was mass produced. You'll have to fact check me, but I would say there's no more than anywhere from 3 to 5 lunchboxes in existence. As a result, this becomes one of the most collectible lunchboxes amongst lunchbox collectors because it was never sold, but there were a few floating around, and so you could see a lunchbox like this, I think sells anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 and up. And there's probably 2 to 3 lunchboxes that fit this bill. There's this one, The Man from Atlantis, which featured Patrick Duffy, also about 2 to 3 of those, and then I have another prototype here. This is not as popular, so it's not a $20,000, $30,000 lunchbox, but Project Shuttle was like a Canadian plastic lunchbox. Never was really mass produced, and I had the artwork, or the story on this. I had seen this come up at a estate sale somewhere outside of Omaha, and I'm watching it online, and I ended up buying the artwork from a guy who was at that auction. And then I saw in the pictures that this lunchbox was there too. And I was trying to get the estate person to let me know who bought it, do you have any other info, because I want to keep these together. But this was in 2005, I bought this. And for the longest time, for the next, 2005 to 2022, was that 12 years or something, I was setting up alerts on eBay and searching for this lunchbox. Literally 6 to 8 months ago, on a Facebook group of lunchbox collectors, somebody posted this and said, "Oh, my dad found this at a garage sale. What's it worth?" And the timing was right because I was on the site, because lunchbox collectors will eat that up. And I emailed the guy, messaged him, "Please sell this to me. I have the artwork. I'm trying to get them together." And we transacted over Facebook, and then, so after 12 years, I was able to connect the one lunchbox with the one piece of art, which was kind of a remarkable story. And then I could get rid of my eBay alert for Project Shuttle lunchbox, which was up for 12 years. So this is probably one of the coolest things in my collection, is the sideband art. Artwork was made by Aladdin and Thermos for every lunchbox. Thermos, however, destroyed or got rid of most of its artwork. Threw it out, and I've talked to a couple people, it was just discarded. This is just production stuff. Aladdin kept a lot of it. In 2000, I'll have to fact check my date, 2002, 2003, Aladdin went bankrupt and had to restructure. And so then when that happened, the Smithsonian came into Aladdin in Tennessee and took out a lot of documents and artwork and lunchboxes, which became the archives for the Aladdin Industries. They have so much stuff. So these are the side bands, which I think are cool because most people, when you look at a lunchbox, you don't really get an appreciation for the rim because that's where you set things down, blah, blah, blah. You look at the front and back. But I think the side band artwork is also just so cool to see it laid out flat because it really does tell a story of the lunchbox. So up top we've got Adam 12, then you have the Robin Hood Disney movie. Over here you've got, I think it's Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, you've got Jungle Book from the 70s, you got a Bonanza, and then you have Land of the Giants. And these are really rare. The Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and Land of the Giants are two of the most collectible lunchboxes. And to have the original artwork, and I have the front or back of a couple of them as well, very, very unique. And then this is just a couple cool pieces of artwork as well. What I'll say about these, as I mentioned, most of the thermos artwork was destroyed. So what's in existence and that's circulating is largely Aladdin. However, I met the guy, I was doing some research, and Alan Woodall is the man's name, and he lives down in Georgia. He has the Lunchbox Museum, and I saw on his wall some artwork and some production plates. And so when I was living in New York, I called him, I made contact, I said, hey, can I come down and visit you? I would really like to buy your artwork and your production plates. What's cool about what I bought there that's different, why I'm saying it, is this artwork that he has is by Thermos Company, which is, the 80 to 90% of theirs was destroyed, but all of their Thermos artwork that I've seen, I mean, I have most of it. There's about 6, 7 pieces that I've seen circulating. This is for the G.I. Joe lunchbox, nonetheless, which is probably one of the most collectible brands. And so you don't see, you know, it doesn't have the final markings on it. It says G.I. Joe and all that stuff, but you can see G.I. Joe lunch kit, King Sealy Thermos, never been on display before. I mean, these are truly one of a kind, hard to find, and they never pop up on eBay. You can't, most of this stuff you can't hardly find on eBay because it's really unique, higher dollar, rare, one-off stuff. All right, let's go on into this room. Many people kind of think of collecting in the 80s and 90s. That's really when it was at its heyday, but the origins of lunchbox collecting is traced back to a gentleman named Bob Carr. He was a doctor in St. Louis, and he started to get interested in lunchboxes and was communicating back and forth with the manufacturers, Aladdin, Thermos, and everybody, to try to document the entire population of lunchboxes. Remember, this is before the internet, this is before email, so it's physical letters sending back and forth. And his goal was to create kind of a comprehensive price guide, a comprehensive listing of everything. And so, in order to do that, once he did some of his research, he published an article in 1979 in Antique Trader magazine. And it was really the first time documented that lunchboxes as collectibles. It's the first time on record. And he is, amongst all the collecting community, widely deemed as the guy that got it started. It doesn't end there. So here's the story that's what's interesting about him. So he did all this great research, but then he passed away, and he had a ton of lunchboxes, and his wife didn't know what to do with them. So she sent out a letter to a bunch of collectors, saying, I don't know what to do with this, I just want to sell it all at once. And Alan Woodall, the gentleman who owns the Lunchbox Museum, had responded, and he said, I can't give you the top dollar, but what I can do is do a price guide and I'll dedicate it to Bob. And then that sold the deal. So he got her the lunchboxes, and sure enough, he published his price guide and has a dedication to Bob Carr in it. So when I visited Alan Woodall and bought his art, he also gave me a bunch of bags of paper, and I didn't know what the heck it was. But when I looked at the box of paper goods that he gave me, it told the story of Bob Carr. It was all his original correspondence that Alan Woodall got in this whole transaction. And that allowed me to piece together this story. Because what you see, these are letters to and from, and I have more, but these are just representative, Ohio Art manufactured lunchboxes. It's to Bob Carr. It's him it's responses to his inquiries about documenting lunchboxes. Here it is, William Hart Adler was the agency for Aladdin that did the marketing. And here's Thermos. And you can see it started to tell me insights into his thought process and what he was trying to do. And I have all the original documents, unbeknownst to me at the time when I got them. But it really laid out the entire story of collecting, and it was the origins of how these things became kind of collectible. But then lunchboxes really became collectible. They started on the map with a gentleman called Scott Bruce. He published a few books. First was this complete boxography, which is just a listing of lunchboxes. It's dot matrix printer. This is original, like his first generation. But then he went and did a 50s lunchbox, which is just a colored, beautiful color book with lunchbox imagery and some stories that he had created and developed in his conversations and research. then he did a price guide. And then all of a sudden this brought a whole new collecting community into it. He was marketing this on articles, he was on TV, and then all of a sudden people got really interested and it created a whole new community. And then in the 90s, early 90s, again, before eBay, the way people used to, the true avid crazies like myself, and this is a little bit before my time in collecting, I started in like 93, 94, they had conventions. And so people would convene in Oak Ridge, Tennessee for the Boxorama, and they had 6 of these, one every year. It's a huge convention. These are buttons they sold. His name's Bill Henry, and he's a great guy. And he sold me a bunch of stuff, and then also just gave me all this for the exhibit, and he said you can just keep it. But these are the pins that would have been set up that first time for people as they walk in to buy a $5 pin about Boxorama. So these are little mini profiles of some of the prominent artists. And it was hard to select them, but I was able to whittle it down. So Bob Burton was the guy, one of the first artists at Aladdin. He is largely attributed with having come up with that idea of Hopalong Cassidy on a lunchbox. So that's why he's really prominent in this story. But he also did, this is one of his original artworks for the late 60s, late 60s, or it might be early 70s, no, more like late 60s Robin Hood lunchbox. Elmer Lenhart is probably the most notable artist amongst the collecting community because he was such a prominent figure at Aladdin for so long. And he was responsible for so many lunchboxes, and the people that I talked to worked for him. And he was an interesting character. He had spent some time as a professional wrestler. He was kind of a guy's guy. He's a little bit curmudgeon at times, but had a good sense of humor as well. But he did a lot of this art, like Land of the Giants, Beverly Hillbillies, Dr. Dolittle. And what they say is a signature of his style is that he would often be very focused on the hands that are in the hand paintings. So, a lot of his have hands, and they're very more detailed than traditionally people would do in a lunchbox, and that was kind of his thing. And sometimes he would paint himself in there as well, which some of the artists would do, unbeknownst to the people making the decisions. They would sketch themselves or their kids in the lunchbox. And this was an original piece. This is a one-off thing that Aladdin did for Elmer Lenhart. It's from 2 different lunchboxes that he made. It was like, I don't know if it was a birthday gift or an anniversary from the company, but it's a metal production sheet from 2 dome lunchboxes, or from 2 lunchboxes, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and It's About Time. This would not normally be made. I mean, these aren't produced in the same run, so it was custom made for him and it was hanging in his office. And I picked it up in these acquisitions that I'd made over the years, which is very cool. It's very cool to have the story. I think the stories are even more cool. On this wall, this is the Thermos. These are a few artists from Thermos, which is extremely rare in the world of lunchbox artwork, if that is such a thing. And so what I like, this one, I have all 3 pieces of the Knight Rider lunchbox. So I've got the front, the back, and then the side band, which isn't on display, is at home. And it's all nicely framed. And there you see the lunchbox on a nice rotating display. I think this is one of my coolest ones. I don't know why I like it. I mean, maybe I watch too much Knight Rider, but it's very cool. And this is another one of his pieces, a show called Mr. Merlin. I don't really recall it, but I have the front and back of the Mr. Merlin lunchbox, which you can see there displayed. And then last, or second to last, Nick Lobianco was also an artist for Thermos. He did quite a few cool lunchboxes, but I think what he's most known for that's interesting is that he did the Peanuts lunchbox so well that Charles Schulz actually gave him kind of responsibility for all the global merchandising of Peanuts. And so that was kind of a unique thing here. And what you see is the Peanuts lunchbox, and then these are the production plates that I got from like an Alan Woodall, where they're just flat pieces cut out with different stages, different colors. The other thing, which is what I think is cool, because it's not necessarily lunchbox specific, it's really all collector specific, is how do you assess value of an item that's collectible. Sports cards, lunchboxes, Star Wars figures. And there's really a few different drivers. One is scarcity, just how much was made. Another one is what's the content, is it interesting content? And then the third is condition. Those are really the drivers of value. And so what we tried to do over here, this would be a good contrast of scarcity. The Toppy lunchbox was a kind of a one-off interesting one made by I think it's called Stamps or Food Value. It was a grocery store that made a lunchbox. And this is like one of the most highly collectible lunchboxes amongst collectors. It doesn't do much for me. I'm not sure I connect to the content, but I did get one and it's very cool. You've seen it, it'll be on covers of collector magazines for lunchboxes, but they would consider this rare. On the other side is strawberry shortcake from the early to mid 80s. The opposite side, mass produced, all over the place. So all else equal, condition, just by scarcity alone, the topping is so much more valuable. Another topic is content. Most kids would probably go with the Star Wars lunchbox over the generic plaid. And as a result, all else equal, that would be a higher value as a Star Wars lunchbox for collectors. And the final and probably most important thing is condition. So what I've learned is that before eBay, value was largely determined by whoever produced a price guide. And it was largely based on their collection, and it could have been based on whatever motives. And I'm not saying right or wrong. When eBay comes along, all of a sudden, there's much more of a market to say what's the value is, because you've got, at any given year, there's $1 million of vintage lunchboxes sold on eBay any given year. And now everybody has access to that information, and you can make your judgment on what it costs. And so now I've gotten more focused on condition. And so, mint condition is always the most valuable. And in this case, I have one that's in almost perfect shape, never used, and the tag's on it. And then sometimes you open them up, like you were mentioning earlier, there's stuff inside. Maybe it's a sandwich that didn't get discarded. But when they were sold, they'd come with coupons, sometimes a packet of hot cocoa, other things to entice people to buy the lunchbox. But in this case, we've got a scale here of 10 different conditions, from mint all the way down to what we call rust buckets in lunchbox collecting. Like if you call that 100% and that's worth $140, it's a pretty common lunchbox. To let's say a middle grade, to this one here, this is probably worth $10. To this one here, maybe $5. To this one here, this is just good memories, I guess. So that's it. That's the exhibit. I mean, there's so much more I could say, but that's really it. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed the tour of this exhibit. I'm very excited about it. It was a lot of work, and it was great working with the Durham, and I'm excited to see people's feedback. It was very much a passion project for me, and I'm excited to share it with you.